Welcome to Shadow Frames. Today, we delve into a chilling tale surrounding a photograph taken in 1911. 6 children immortalized on film, but not everything is as it seems. Nestled in the rolling hills of rural Massachusetts, the small town of Blackwood Falls had always been a quiet place. In 1911, it was home to just over 2,000 souls, most of whom worked at the lumber mill or in the surrounding farms. The town had one church, one school, and one photography studio, Holloway's portraits and daguerreotypes, owned and operated by Thomas Holloway, a man whose reputation extended far beyond the town limits for his uncanny ability to capture the very essence of his subjects. Blackwood Falls had been established in 1837, named for the dense black walnut forests that once covered the area and the small waterfall that powered the original sawmill. By 1911, much of the forest had been cleared, but the waterfall remained, feeding into the mill pond that served as both a practical necessity for the town's industry and a scenic centerpiece that the residents took pride in. The pond was particularly beautiful in autumn, when the surrounding maples and oaks painted their reflections across its surface in vivid reds and golds. Thomas Holloway was not a Blackwood Falls native. He had arrived in the spring of 1908, purchased the abandoned watchmaker's shop on Main Street, and transformed it into a photography studio. A tall, gaunt man with prematurely silver hair, despite being only in his mid-30s, Holloway kept to himself. He spoke little of his past, only mentioning that he had studied photography in Boston and had traveled extensively before deciding to settle in Blackwood Falls. Before coming to Blackwood Falls, Holloway had worked in various cities along the East Coast, New York, Philadelphia, Baltimore, always staying just long enough to establish a reputation before moving on. Those who inquired deeply enough would learn that he had once been employed by the prestigious Eastman Kodak Company, developing new chemical processes for their photographic plates. He had left under mysterious circumstances, though rumors suggested it involved an accident in the laboratory that had resulted in a fire and the death of a colleague. Whatever the truth of his past, Holloway arrived in Blackwood Falls with a custom-built camera unlike anything the townspeople had ever seen. Its brass fittings gleamed, and the mahogany casing was polished to a high shine. But most distinctive was the lens, unusually large and made of multiple glass elements, giving it a depth and complexity that seemed almost hypnotic when the light caught it at certain angles. The townspeople found him strange but respected his talent. There was something about his photographs, a certain depth, a lifelike quality that other photographers couldn't replicate. Within a year of his arrival, having one's portrait taken by Thomas Holloway had become something of a status symbol in Blackwood Falls and the surrounding communities. The peculiar thing about Holloway's photographs wasn't just their remarkable clarity or the way he captured his subjects' expressions with such precision. It was the way the images seemed almost alive, as if at any moment the people in the portraits might step out of the frame. Some of the more superstitious residents of Blackwood Falls whispered that there was something unnatural about Holloway's abilities, but such rumors were quickly dismissed by the more rational members of the community. Mrs. Eleanor Abbott, the elderly widow who ran the local post office, was one of the few who openly expressed her reservations about the photographer. "There's something not right about those pictures," she would say to anyone who would listen. "They're too alive, and that man, with his strange eyes that never seemed to blink, he sees too much." But most attributed her misgivings to age and an overactive imagination. Holloway's techniques were his closely guarded secret. He mixed his own chemical solutions for developing the plates, working alone in the back room of his studio behind a heavy velvet curtain. The distinctive scent of those chemicals, sharp and acrid, yet with an underlying sweetness that no one could quite identify, often lingered on the clothing of those who had sat for portraits, sometimes for days afterward. His first commission in Blackwood Falls had been a portrait of the Miller family, George and Martha Miller, and their 7-year-old son, Michael. The Millers had moved to town just a month before Holloway's arrival, with George taking a position as bookkeeper at the lumber mill. They were a pleasant, unremarkable family, except perhaps for young Michael's extraordinary talent for swimming, unusual in a child so young. The portrait Holloway produced of the Millers was stunning, capturing a sense of vitality and connection that made the family appear almost radiant. Martha Miller's eyes held a warmth that seemed to glow from within. George's quiet strength was evident in the set of his shoulders, and young Michael, seated between them, had been captured in a rare moment of stillness, his usually restless energy momentarily contained, his dark eyes holding a depth that seemed beyond his years. 3 weeks after the portrait was completed, Michael Miller drowned in the mill pond. It was early March, and although the spring thaw had begun, patches of ice still floated on the water's surface. The boy had apparently been playing alone, attempting to see how far he could slide across one of these ice patches. The ice broke, plunging him into the frigid water. By the time he was found, it was too late. The tragedy cast a pall over Blackwood Falls. The Millers, devastated by their loss, remained in town only long enough to bury their son in the small cemetery behind the church before moving away to start anew elsewhere. They left behind most of their possessions, including Holloway's portrait, which they couldn't bear to look at anymore. Strangely, the portrait was never found among their abandoned belongings. When asked, Holloway claimed that George Miller had returned it to the studio, requesting that it be destroyed. No one had reason to doubt his word on the matter, and in the wake of such tragedy, it seemed a reasonable request. In the months that followed, Holloway's business flourished. His portraits became highly sought after, not just in Blackwood Falls, but in neighboring towns as well. People would travel for hours by horse and buggy to sit for him. There was something almost addictive about seeing oneself through Holloway's lens, more vital, more essentially yourself than you appeared in the mirror. On the morning of October 17, 1911, the bell above Holloway's studio door chimed as Evelyn Foster entered with her 5 children in tow. Evelyn was the widow of James Foster, who had died in a logging accident 2 years prior, leaving her to raise their children alone. She worked as a seamstress, taking in mending and creating dresses for the ladies of Blackwood Falls. Despite her modest means, she was determined to have a family portrait taken before winter set in, a memento to send to her ailing mother in Connecticut. "Mr. Holloway," Evelyn said, ushering her brood into the studio, "I've finally saved enough for that family portrait we discussed." Thomas Holloway looked up from his ledger, his pale blue eyes taking in the 6 Fosters standing before him. Evelyn, with her chestnut hair pulled back in a simple bun, wore her Sunday best, a navy blue dress with a high collar, adorned with a simple cameo brooch. Behind her stood her children. William, the eldest at 12, a serious boy with his father's strong jaw. The 10-year-old twins, Elizabeth and Emily, identical in their white pinafores with matching ribbons in their fair hair. 8-year-old Robert, small for his age with perpetually scuffed knees. And finally, little Catherine, just 6 years old, clutching a worn rag doll. "Mrs. Foster," Holloway nodded, closing his ledger. "I'm afraid I have another appointment in an hour. Will that be enough time?" "Yes, quite sufficient," Evelyn replied, already smoothing William's collar and attempting to tame Robert's cowlick with a licked thumb. Holloway began preparing his equipment, moving with practiced efficiency. His camera was an impressive apparatus, mounted on a polished wooden tripod with brass fittings that gleamed in the soft north light that filtered through the large studio windows. The camera itself was enclosed in a wooden box with a leather bellows that could be extended or compressed to adjust the focus. At the back of the camera was the plate holder, where Holloway would insert the glass plates coated with light-sensitive emulsion. As he worked, Holloway observed the Foster children with a professional eye, noting how the light fell across their features, how they moved and interacted with one another. William, the eldest, had a protective air about him, standing slightly in front of his siblings as if ready to shield them from any potential harm. The twins, Elizabeth and Emily, were inseparable, their hands frequently touching, finishing each other's sentences in a way that Holloway found both charming and slightly unsettling. Robert was a bundle of restless energy, his eyes darting about the studio, taking in every detail. And little Catherine, she was different from the others, more observant, more sensitive perhaps. As Catherine wandered around the studio, her curious eyes taking in the various photographs displayed on the walls, solemn families, stern-faced individuals, the occasional wedding portrait. Unlike most photography studios of the era, which displayed their subjects in rigid, formal poses, Holloway's portraits captured people in more natural moments. A father with his hand resting gently on his son's shoulder, a mother gazing down at her infant with genuine tenderness, a young couple standing close, their fingers just barely touching in a suggestion of intimacy. "Your little one seems fascinated by the photographs," Holloway remarked, glancing at Catherine. Evelyn smiled. "She has a vivid imagination, loves stories and pictures." As Catherine moved from one photograph to another, she stopped before a particular portrait, a solitary child seated on a chair, hands folded neatly in his lap. Unlike the other subjects who stared directly at the camera, This boy's eyes seemed to look slightly off to the side, as if watching something just beyond the frame. His expression was solemn, almost sad, but there was something else there too. A hint of anticipation, perhaps, or longing. "Who's that boy?" Catherine asked, pointing at the photograph. Holloway paused in his preparations. "That's young Henry Wilson, taken last spring." Catherine tilted her head, studying the image. "No," she said with the simple certainty of a child. "That's not his name." Holloway's hands stilled for a moment, his eyes meeting Catherine's with an intensity that would have been unsettling had anyone else been watching. But Evelyn was busy adjusting the twins' hair ribbons, and the other children were exploring other parts of the studio. "What makes you say that, child?" Holloway asked, his voice carefully neutral. "He told me," Catherine replied, then skipped away to join her brothers, the moment forgotten as quickly as it had occurred. Holloway watched her go, a slight frown creasing his forehead. Then, shaking off whatever thought had momentarily troubled him, he returned to his preparations. "He looks sad," Catherine observed. "Perhaps," Holloway replied noncommittally. "Now, shall we begin? I'd like the family to sit on that bench there," Mrs. Foster in the middle with the children arranged around her. As Holloway positioned the family, the studio door opened again, and a boy of about 7 or 8 entered. He had dark hair and pale skin, wearing a gray woolen suit that seemed a size too large for his thin frame. His movements were oddly fluid, almost gliding across the polished wooden floor without making a sound. "Ah, Michael," Holloway said, looking up. "Right on time." Evelyn Foster looked confused. "I'm sorry. I thought we had the studio to ourselves for the hour." "Michael is my assistant," Holloway explained smoothly. "He helps me with the chemical preparations and plate handling. You'll hardly notice he's here." The boy didn't speak, but moved to the back of the studio where Holloway's developing equipment was set up, partially hidden behind a heavy velvet curtain. His eyes, dark and unblinking, seemed to take in everything at once. Catherine stared at him, a small furrow appearing between her brows. "Now," Holloway continued, returning to the Fosters. "William, stand behind your mother's right shoulder, the twins on either side of her. Robert, you'll sit on this small stool here at her feet, and Catherine can sit on her lap." As the family settled into position, Catherine whispered to her mother, "That boy looks like the one in the picture." "Hush, dear," Evelyn murmured, adjusting her daughter on her lap. From behind his camera, Holloway frowned. "The composition is not quite right." He tapped his chin thoughtfully. "Michael, could you join the photograph? Stand beside William. It would balance the frame better." Before Evelyn could protest this unusual request, Michael had already moved to stand beside William. The Foster boy shifted uncomfortably, a slight shiver running through him as Michael took his place. There was something about the way Michael stood, perfectly still, without the small natural movements that even the most disciplined subject couldn't suppress during a long exposure. William felt a strange sensation where Michael's shoulder almost touched his, not quite cold, but an absence of warmth, as if the space the boy occupied was somehow removed from the normal flow of air and heat in the room. He wanted to step away, but found himself unable to move, his limbs suddenly heavy, as if he were standing in deep water. "Perfect," Holloway declared, disappearing beneath the black cloth drape of his camera. "Now, everyone remain absolutely still. The exposure will take several seconds." The family froze, holding their expressions as the camera's shutter opened. The studio was silent except for the ticking of a large clock on the wall. Little Catherine, despite her mother's whispered reminder to stay still, couldn't help but glance sideways at Michael. There was something about the boy that both fascinated and unsettled her. His skin had an almost translucent quality in the diffused light of the studio, and she could see faint blue veins beneath the surface. And his hands. There was something odd about his hands, though Catherine couldn't quite define what it was. As Catherine watched, a single drop of water fell from Michael's sleeve, landing on the polished wooden floor with a soft plop that seemed impossibly loud in the silent studio. No one else appeared to notice. Not her mother, not her siblings, not even Mr. Holloway behind his camera. Just as she was about to speak, to point out the growing puddle at Michael's feet, Holloway's voice came from behind the camera. "Excellent," Holloway said after the exposure was complete. "I shall have the prints ready in a week's time." As the Fosters gathered their things to leave, Catherine tugged at her mother's sleeve. "Mama, that boy's hands are strange." "Catherine, it's impolite to comment on others' appearances," Evelyn scolded gently. "But, no buts. Now thank Mr. Holloway for his time." The family departed, leaving Holloway and Michael alone in the studio. As the door closed behind them, Holloway turned to the boy. "You did well today, Michael," he said softly. "Very well indeed." Michael remained silent, his dark eyes fixed on the camera. Then slowly he raised his right hand, examining it with a curious detachment. The fingers were elongated, the webbing between them more pronounced than it had been before. He flexed them experimentally, watching as water droplets formed at the tips and fell to the floor. "The process is accelerating," Holloway observed, more to himself than to the boy. "Each exposure draws you further into this world, yet binds you more firmly to the other. Fascinating." He moved to the back room, where his developing equipment was set up. Michael followed, his footsteps leaving small, wet impressions on the floor that evaporated almost immediately. Outside, as the Foster family made their way down Main Street toward home, William seemed unusually quiet. "What's the matter, Will?" Evelyn asked, noticing her son's pallor. "Nothing, Mother," he replied, but his voice lacked its usual confidence. "Just a chill." Indeed, the October air had turned crisp, with the scent of wood smoke and fallen leaves mingling in the breeze. The maple trees that lined the street blazed with autumn colors, crimson, gold, and russet, their falling leaves crunching underfoot. Above them, a murder of crows circled the church steeple, their harsh cries cutting through the peaceful afternoon. Robert ran ahead, kicking at piles of leaves, while the twins walked arm in arm, whispering to each other as they often did. Catherine, still clutching her rag doll, kept looking back over her shoulder, as if expecting to see someone following them. But the street behind them was empty, save for the swirling leaves dancing in the wind. That night, William dreamed of water, dark, cold water closing over his head, filling his lungs, dragging him down into depths that seemed to have no end. In the dream, he struggled against the current, his limbs growing heavier with each movement. Just as panic began to overwhelm him, he felt a small hand grasp his own, a child's hand, but wrong somehow, the fingers too long, the skin too slick. He looked down and saw Michael, the boy from the photography studio, his dark eyes now glowing with a pale blue light, his mouth open in what might have been a smile or a silent scream. "It's peaceful here," Michael said, his voice somehow clear despite the water that surrounded them. "Stay with me. You'll never be cold again." William awoke with a gasp, his nightshirt soaked with sweat, his heart pounding in his chest. The room was dark, but moonlight filtered through the curtains, casting long shadows across the floor. For a moment, he thought he saw a small figure standing in the corner, a boy in a gray suit, water dripping from his sleeves. But when he blinked, the corner was empty. A week later, Evelyn Foster returned to collect the photographs. Holloway presented her with a large portrait, beautifully mounted in a cardboard frame embossed with his studio's name in elegant gilt lettering. The price had been dear, nearly a month's earnings from her sewing, but as she gazed at the image, Evelyn felt a surge of pride and satisfaction. "It's wonderful," Evelyn breathed, studying the image. There they were, she and her 5 children, looking their finest. And there, standing beside William, was Michael, the peculiar assistant. "Mr. Holloway, while I appreciate the quality of your work, I had hoped for a portrait of just my family," Evelyn said carefully. "Is there perhaps another print without your assistant?" Holloway's expression remained impassive. "I'm afraid this was the only successful exposure, Mrs. Foster. The others were flawed. But I assure you this is a superior composition. The balance is much improved with 6 children rather than 5. He didn't mention that he had in fact created 3 plates that day. The first had indeed been flawed. One of the twins had blinked, and Robert's perpetual fidgeting had resulted in a slight blur. The second plate had captured the Foster family perfectly, without Michael's presence. But the third, the one from which the final print had been made, this was the one that interested Holloway most. He had exposed this plate for slightly longer than necessary, allowing the silver halides to capture what the human eye could not see. Evelyn wanted to protest further, but found herself reluctant to offend the photographer. Besides, the portrait was indeed beautiful, capturing a certain luminous quality in all their faces. The children looked healthier, more vibrant than in real life. William's cheeks had a flush of color that had been absent of late. The twins' eyes sparkled with mischief. Robert's usually rumpled appearance was tidied, and little Catherine radiated a sweet innocence. "Very well," she conceded, paying the agreed-upon sum. "Thank you, Mr. Holloway." As she turned to leave, the portrait carefully wrapped in brown paper and string, Holloway's voice stopped her. "Mrs. Foster," he said, his tone oddly formal. "May I ask, Have your children been sleeping well since our session? Evelyn turned back, surprised by the question. Why, yes, I believe so. Why do you ask? Holloway seemed to consider his words carefully. No reason of importance, only that sometimes children find the photography process unsettling. Nightmares are not uncommon afterward. I see, Evelyn replied, though she didn't. Not really. Well, thank you for your concern, but they've been perfectly fine. Holloway nodded, a small, enigmatic smile playing at the corners of his mouth. I'm glad to hear it. Good day, Mrs. Foster. After she left, Holloway retreated to the back room of his studio, where Michael waited, sitting unnaturally still on a high stool. She's taken the bait, Holloway said, more to himself than to the boy. Now we wait. That evening, as Evelyn displayed the new portrait on the mantelpiece of their modest home, Catherine stared at it with unusual intensity. What is it, Kitty? William asked his little sister. His hand, Catherine whispered, pointing at Michael in the photograph. Look at his hand. William leaned closer, squinting at the image. Michael's right hand hung at his side, partially obscured by shadow, but there did seem to be something odd about its proportions. The fingers appeared longer than they should be, and the angle of the thumb was slightly unnatural, as if it bent in a place where no joint should exist. It's just the way the light falls, William assured her, though a flicker of unease passed across his features. Photography can play tricks on the eye, but Catherine wasn't convinced. She continued to stare at the portrait, particularly at Michael's hand, until Evelyn called the children to supper. The Foster home was a modest two-story cottage on the edge of town with weathered clapboard siding and green shutters that needed a fresh coat of paint. Inside, it was simply furnished but clean and well kept. The front parlor, where the portrait now hung, had a small brick fireplace, a worn but comfortable settee, and 2 armchairs that had belonged to James Foster's parents. A braided rug covered most of the wooden floor, and lace curtains, made by Evelyn herself, adorned the windows. The house had been built in the 1870s by James Foster's father, who had been one of the first foremen at the lumber mill. It had weathered many New England winters, its timber frame settling slightly over the decades, giving rise to the occasional creak and groan that the Foster children had learned to ignore. But since the arrival of the portrait, these familiar house sounds had taken on a different quality, sometimes resembling footsteps on the stairs when no one was there, or whispers in empty rooms. The dining room beyond contained a rectangular oak table with 6 chairs, one of which had remained empty since James's death. Evelyn had considered selling it, but couldn't bring herself to do so, as if removing the chair would somehow erase the last physical reminder of her husband's place in their family. That night, Catherine had trouble sleeping. She kept thinking about the boy in the photograph and his strange hand. In her dreams, she saw Michael standing in the corner of her bedroom, watching her with those dark, unblinking eyes. When she awoke with a start in the middle of the night, she could have sworn she saw a shadow slip out of her room. In the dream, Michael had spoken to her, his voice a wet, gurgling whisper that somehow carried perfectly in the still night air. I'm lonely, he had said. So lonely. Won't you come play with me at the pond? Mama, she said over breakfast the next morning. I don't like that picture. Evelyn sighed, serving another spoonful of porridge into Robert's bowl. Catherine, that portrait cost more than a month's mending. It's staying right where it is. But the boy in it, Michael, he's in my dreams. Catherine persisted. His hand is wrong, Mama. It's not like our hands. Nonsense, Evelyn said firmly. It's just your imagination working overtime. Now eat your breakfast before it gets cold. But as the days passed, all the Foster children began to complain of restless nights and unsettling dreams. William, usually so stoic, admitted to his mother that he kept imagining someone standing at the foot of his bed. The twins, who shared a room, both insisted they heard whispers in the dark, voices too faint to make out the words, but with a wet, gurgling quality that made them think of the creek behind their house after heavy rain. Robert claimed he saw a boy who looked like Michael walking down the hallway and vanishing into the wall. The dreams shared certain elements: water, always water, and a persistent invitation to visit the mill pond. The children began to avoid walking past the pond on their way to and from school, taking a longer route that added nearly a quarter mile to their journey. Evelyn dismissed their fears as childhood fancies, perhaps triggered by the ghost stories they sometimes told each other in the evenings. After all, it was nearly Halloween, and the children at school were no doubt exchanging frightening tales, but privately, she too had begun to feel a strange disquiet in the house, a sense of being watched when she was alone. Sometimes, when she passed the portrait on the mantelpiece, she thought she saw movement from the corner of her eye, as if one of the figures had shifted slightly. But when she looked directly at the photograph, everything was as it should be. Still, she couldn't shake the feeling that Michael's eyes seemed to follow her around the room. Most disturbing of all, she began to notice small puddles of water in unexpected places. On the stairs, in the hallway, beside the children's beds. At first, she attributed these to leaks from the roof, but they appeared even on clear days, and never directly beneath any obvious entry point for rainwater. During this time, William's health began to deteriorate. He developed a persistent cough and complained of feeling cold all the time, even when sitting close to the fire. His appetite diminished, and dark circles appeared beneath his eyes. Evelyn worried that he was coming down with influenza and made him drink honey and lemon tea, but his condition continued to worsen. "I feel like I can't get warm, Mama," he said one evening as Evelyn tucked an extra quilt around him. "It's like I've been standing in the pond in January." The reference to the pond sent a chill through Evelyn, though she couldn't have explained why. She placed a hand on William's forehead, finding it cool to the touch despite the beads of sweat that had formed there. "You're just fighting off a chill," she assured him, trying to convince herself as much as her son. "You'll be right as rain in no time." But that night, Evelyn found herself standing before the portrait on the mantelpiece, studying it with growing unease. In the flickering light of the oil lamp, the images seemed to shift subtly, as if the subjects were breathing. And Michael, the strange boy who shouldn't have been there at all, his eyes seemed somehow blacker than before, his smile a bit wider, his hand a bit more wrong. 2 weeks after bringing the portrait home, Evelyn was awakened in the middle of the night by Catherine's screams. She rushed to her daughter's room to find the child sitting up in bed, pointing at the corner of the room, her face pale with terror. "He's there, Mama. Michael's there." Evelyn lit the oil lamp, illuminating the empty corner. "There's no one here, darling. You've had a nightmare." But Catherine was inconsolable. "His hand, Mama. His hand isn't right." Between sobs, Catherine described her dream. How Michael had come to her bedside and asked her to go with him to the pond. How he had reached out to take her hand, and how she had seen that his fingers were webbed like a frog's, the skin glistening and greenish in the moonlight. "He said he wants to show me where he lives," Catherine whispered, "under the water. He says it's pretty there, with lights and music. But I don't want to go, Mama. I don't want to go under the water." Evelyn held her daughter close, murmuring reassurances. But as she glanced toward the darkened window, she felt a chill that had nothing to do with the October night. For just a moment, she thought she saw a pale face looking in from outside. Impossible, given that Catherine's room was on the second floor. "Can I sleep with you tonight?" Catherine asked, her small body trembling against Evelyn's. "Of course, sweetheart," Evelyn replied, helping her daughter out of bed. As they turned to leave the room, Evelyn's foot splashed into a small puddle on the floor, a puddle that hadn't been there when she'd entered. The next day, Evelyn decided to visit Thomas Holloway again. The children's fears were becoming disruptive, and she hoped the photographer might have some insight into young Michael that could help her reassure them. Perhaps the boy was simply shy or had some minor deformity that Catherine had noticed, and which was now coloring her dreams. When she arrived at the studio, however, she found the door locked and a small sign in the window, closed until further notice. Puzzled, she crossed the street to Abbott's General Store, where Harriet Abbott, the proprietress and town gossip, might know something of Holloway's whereabouts. The bell jangled as Evelyn entered the store, which smelled of coffee beans, tobacco, and the sweet tang of barrel pickles. The wooden floor creaked beneath her feet as she made her way to the counter where Harriet Abbott, a plump woman with bright, inquisitive eyes and prematurely gray hair pulled into a tight bun, was weighing flour for Mrs. Henderson. "Good morning, Evelyn," Harriet called. "Be with you in just a moment." Once Mrs. Henderson had paid and left with her purchases, Harriet turned her full attention to Evelyn. "What can I get for you today?" "I just received a shipment of the most beautiful buttons from Boston, mother of pearl, perfect for that blue dress you're making for the Reverend's wife." "Actually, Harriet, I was wondering if you knew anything about Mr. Holloway's sudden closure. I needed to speak with him about our family portrait." "Oh, Mrs. Foster," Harriet said, lowering her voice conspiratorially. "Haven't you heard? The most peculiar thing. Mr. Holloway left town 2 days ago. No warning, no explanation. Just packed up in the middle of the night, according to Mrs. Reynolds next door to the studio. Says she heard all sorts of commotion around midnight. Furniture being moved, glass breaking. Thought about calling the sheriff, she did. But you know how nervous she is about everything since Mr. Reynolds passed. Did he say where he was going? Evelyn asked, a knot forming in her stomach. Not a word to anyone. But there's more. Harriet leaned closer across the counter, the scent of lavender water wafting from her clothing. The sheriff went to look at the studio yesterday, making sure nothing was amiss, you understand. And he said it was the strangest thing. All of Holloway's equipment was still there, his cameras and chemicals and whatnot. Only thing missing were the photographs from the walls. Did the sheriff notice anything unusual in the studio? Evelyn asked hesitantly. Harriet's eyes widened with interest. Unusual how? I don't know. Anything out of the ordinary. Water, perhaps. Water? Harriet looked confused. Well, now that you mention it, Sheriff Miller did say something about a damp spot on the floor near the dark room. Thought perhaps a chemical had spilled. Why do you ask? Evelyn shook her head. No reason, just curious. There is one other odd thing, Harriet added, clearly enjoying having such a captive audience for her gossip. The day before Holloway disappeared, young Timothy Walsh, you know, the butcher's boy, says he saw Holloway down by the mill pond in the middle of the night. Says Holloway was kneeling at the edge of the water, talking to someone, though Timothy couldn't see who. Probably just the imaginings of a half-asleep child, but still, quite strange, wouldn't you say? Evelyn felt a chill run down her spine. And, was there any sign of a boy? His assistant, Michael? Harriet looked confused. Assistant? Mr. Holloway never had an assistant, dear. He always worked alone. Prided himself on it, in fact. Said his methods were proprietary and couldn't be shared, even with an apprentice. But I saw him. A boy named Michael. He was even in our family portrait. Harriet shook her head, her expression softening with sympathy. Must be someone from out of town. No child by that name lives in Blackwood Falls. Not since the Millers lost their boy back in '09. The Millers? Yes. Such a tragedy. Their son Michael drowned in the mill pond. Only 7 years old. Harriet's voice dropped even lower. They say he was playing on the ice in early spring when it gave way. His body wasn't found for 3 days. By then, she shuddered, leaving the rest unsaid. Mr. Holloway actually took a photograph of the boy just a week before the accident. His first job in town, if I recall correctly. The Millers treasured that portrait, kept it on their mantle, but they couldn't bear to stay in Blackwood Falls after what happened. Moved out to Ohio to live with Mrs. Miller's sister. And the portrait? Evelyn asked, her mouth suddenly dry. Did they take it with them? Harriet frowned, considering. You know, I'm not sure. I don't recall seeing them pack it. But surely they wouldn't leave behind their only image of their lost boy. But Evelyn was already moving toward the door, her mind racing with the implications of what she had just learned. Evelyn? Harriet called after her. Is everything all right? Yes, fine, Evelyn replied distractedly. Thank you, Harriet. I just remembered something urgent I need to attend to. Evelyn hurried home, her mind racing. When she arrived, she went straight to the mantelpiece and took down the family portrait, studying it with new eyes. There was Michael, standing beside William, his face solemn and pale, and his hand. She hadn't noticed it before, but now that Catherine had mentioned it, there did seem to be something wrong with its proportions. The fingers too long and thin, the angle unnatural. William was in bed, his cough having worsened overnight. He had begun complaining of a strange sensation, a pressure in his chest, as if something heavy were sitting on it, making it difficult to breathe. The town doctor had visited that morning and diagnosed the early stages of pneumonia, prescribing bed rest and warm poultices. Evelyn sat at her son's bedside, bathing his forehead with cool water to bring down his fever. William drifted in and out of sleep, occasionally murmuring words she couldn't quite catch. Once he sat up suddenly, his eyes wide but unfocused, and pointed to the corner of the room. He's here again, William whispered. He wants me to go with him. Who's here, darling? Evelyn asked, though she feared she knew the answer. Michael, William replied, his voice distant. He says it's peaceful in the water. Says I won't be cold anymore. A wave of dread washed over Evelyn. She glanced at the corner where William was pointing, but saw nothing. Still, the air in that part of the room seemed somehow different, denser, colder, with a faint scent of muddy water and decaying vegetation. Michael drowned. William continued, his gaze fixed on the empty corner. But he says he's not dead. Not really. He's just waiting for friends to join him. No one's there, William, Evelyn said firmly, trying to keep the fear from her voice. It's just the fever making you imagine things. But William shook his head weakly. He's there, Mama, and he's getting closer. Every day, he gets a little closer. Soon, he says, he'll be able to touch me. That evening, after the children were in bed, Evelyn retrieved her late husband's magnifying glass from his desk drawer. Under the yellow light of the oil lamp, she examined Michael's image more closely. His hand was partially in shadow, but as she peered at it through the magnifying glass, she could see that the fingers were not merely elongated. They seemed to be partially webbed, like the feet of a duck or a frog, and the thumb bent at an impossible angle, as if it had an extra joint. The more she studied the photograph, the more details she noticed that had escaped her initial viewing. Michael's eyes, unlike the warm, living expressions captured in the faces of her own children, had a flat, glassy quality, like the eyes of a dead fish at the market. His clothing, which had appeared to be a simple gray suit, now showed dark stains around the collar and cuffs, as if the fabric had been submerged in water and never properly dried. And there was something about the way he stood in relation to the others, not quite connected to the group, as if he existed in a slightly different plane than the living, breathing Fosters. Most disturbing of all, as Evelyn studied the photograph, she could have sworn that Michael's expression changed subtly, the blank eyes seeming to focus on her, the neutral mouth curving into the suggestion of a smile. She blinked hard, convinced it was a trick of the flickering lamplight, but when she looked again, the change remained. A cold dread settled over her. This was no mere photographic anomaly or trick of the light. There was something fundamentally wrong with the boy in the photograph, the boy who could not possibly have been there at all. Evelyn's hand trembled, causing the magnifying glass to slip and scratch the surface of the photograph. To her horror, where the glass had scraped across Michael's image, a dark substance began to seep from the scratch, like blood welling from a cut. But it wasn't blood. It was a black, viscous fluid that smelled faintly of the chemicals used in photographic development, mixed with the unmistakable stench of stagnant pond water. The fluid began to spread, not just from the scratch, but from Michael's image itself, as if the photograph were somehow bleeding from within. Droplets fell onto the wooden floor with soft, wet sounds. Where they landed, the polished surface began to discolor and warp, as if being consumed by some corrosive substance. Panicking, Evelyn dropped the photograph into the fireplace, where the embers from that evening's fire still glowed. The portrait caught immediately, curling and blackening at the edges. As it burned, Evelyn could have sworn she heard a faint, high-pitched keening sound, like a child in pain. The flames turned an unnatural greenish-blue color, casting eerie shadows around the room. The air filled with an acrid smoke that made Evelyn's eyes water and her throat burn. For a moment, in the dancing flames, Evelyn thought she saw a face. Michael's face, contorted in a silent scream, his webbed hands reaching out as if trying to escape the fire. Then the flames surged higher, consuming the image completely. When the fire finally died down, leaving nothing but ashes, Evelyn knelt by the hearth for several minutes, struggling to compose herself. The grandfather clock in the corner struck midnight, its deep tones echoing through the silent house. From upstairs came the sound of one of the children turning restlessly in bed. Once the photograph was nothing but ashes, Evelyn went to check on her children, fear clutching at her heart. To her relief, all five were sleeping peacefully, their faces relaxed for the first time in weeks. Even William's breathing seemed easier, the rattle in his chest less pronounced. That night, Evelyn slept better than she had since bringing the portrait home, though her dreams were troubled by images of dark water and reaching hands. She awoke to sunlight streaming through the curtains and the sound of her children's laughter downstairs, a sound she realized she hadn't heard in days. The next morning, none of the children remembered Michael or their nightmares. It was as if a fog had lifted from the household, restoring their natural cheer and energy. William's fever broke, and though he was still weak, the doctor pronounced him on the mend. The twins resumed their playful bickering. Robert's appetite returned with a vengeance, and Catherine became once again the cheerful, curious child she had always been. Evelyn said nothing of what had happened, grateful for the return to normalcy. When the children asked about the missing portrait, she told them it had fallen and the glass had broken, making it too dangerous to keep. They accepted this explanation without question, seeming almost relieved that the photograph was gone. But her relief was short-lived. 3 days after burning the photograph, William came down with a high fever. The doctor diagnosed pneumonia and prescribed bed rest and mustard plasters. Despite Evelyn's careful nursing, William's condition deteriorated rapidly. In his delirium, he spoke of a boy standing in the corner of his room, beckoning to him. "He wants me to go with him, Mama." William whispered, his eyes glassy with fever. "To the pond. He says it's peaceful there." Evelyn never left his side, keeping a vigil through days and nights that blurred together in a haze of fear and exhaustion. She applied poultices, spooned broth between his cracked lips, and prayed as she had never prayed before. The other children were sent to stay with a neighbor, partly to protect them from contagion, but mostly to shield them from the sight of their brother's decline. On the fourth night of William's illness, during a raging thunderstorm that rattled the windows and sent shadows dancing across the walls, Evelyn dozed off in the chair beside her son's bed. She was awakened by a sudden cold draft and opened her eyes to find the bedroom window open, rain spilling onto the floor. William's bed was empty. Panicking, Evelyn searched the house, calling her son's name. When she found no sign of him, she ran outside into the storm, her nightdress immediately soaked by the downpour. Lightning flashed, illuminating the path to the mill pond, and in that brief harsh light, she saw a small figure walking slowly away from the house. "William!" she screamed, running after him, her bare feet slipping in the mud. Another flash of lightning revealed two figures now. William, moving with the awkward gait of someone deep in a fever dream, and beside him, a smaller boy in a gray suit, holding William's hand, leading him toward the water. Evelyn ran faster, her lungs burning, her heart pounding. She was just yards away when they reached the edge of the pond. In the next lightning flash, she saw William step into the water, guided by the smaller figure whose face turned toward her briefly. Michael, his eyes reflecting the lightning like a cat's, his lips curved in a satisfied smile. "No!" Evelyn cried, flinging herself forward, catching William's nightshirt just as he would have gone under the water. She pulled her son back from the edge, clutching him to her chest. He was cold, so cold, his lips blue, his eyes unfocused. Of Michael, there was no sign. The surface of the pond rippled in the rain, but there was no splash, no disturbance to indicate that another body had entered the water. Yet Evelyn was certain of what she had seen. Her son, hand in hand with a dead boy, about to be led into the depths of the mill pond. She carried William back to the house, his body frighteningly limp in her arms. By some miracle he survived the night, though the doctor, summoned at dawn, shook his head gravely and advised Evelyn to send for the minister. But William did not recover. Very slowly, over the course of a week, his fever receded, and he began to regain his strength. When he was finally able to sit up and take some solid food, Evelyn asked him gently what he remembered of that night. "I had a dream," William said, his voice still weak. "Michael came to me. He said he was lonely, that he needed a friend. He told me if I went with him to the pond, I wouldn't be sick anymore." He shuddered. "I almost went, Mama. I would have if you hadn't come. But you're safe now," Evelyn assured him, stroking his hair. "And Michael is gone. I destroyed the photograph." William looked at her with eyes that seemed much older than his 12 years. "It's not the photograph, Mama. It's the water. He lives in the water, and once he's chosen you, he doesn't let go." The next day, William seemed stronger, even managing to sit by the window for a while, watching the autumn leaves swirl in the yard. But that night, his fever returned with a vengeance. Evelyn sat with him, bathing his forehead, whispering prayers, refusing to leave even for a moment. Still, sometime in the darkest hour of the night, when exhaustion finally overcame her and she dozed in her chair, William slipped away. Not from the house this time. His body remained in the bed, but from life itself. When Evelyn woke, she found him still and cold, his eyes open but unseeing, his lips curved in what might have been relief. The doctor listed the cause of death as pneumonia, but Evelyn knew better. Michael had claimed William after all, not by drowning him in the pond, but by drawing his life force away, a little at a time, until there was nothing left. Within a week, William was dead. The town mourned with Evelyn and her remaining children, attributing the boy's sudden passing to the capricious nature of illness. Only Evelyn connected it to the burned photograph and the drowned boy named Michael. The funeral was held on a gray November day, the sky heavy with unshed snow. As William's small coffin was lowered into the ground, Evelyn thought she glimpsed a figure standing among the distant gravestones, a boy in a gray suit, watching the proceedings with an unreadable expression. But when she blinked, the figure was gone, leaving her to wonder if grief had affected her mind. As the Foster family tried to rebuild their lives after William's death, a package arrived from New York City. It was addressed to Evelyn in an elegant slanted hand that she recognized as Thomas Holloway's. Inside was a letter, and a small photographic print. The letter read, "Mrs. Foster, I feel compelled to offer my sincere condolences on the loss of your son. News travels, even to those who have left Blackwood Falls behind. I must also offer an explanation, though I fear it comes too late to be of use. The boy Michael, who appeared in your family portrait, is not of the living world. He was my first subject in Blackwood Falls, a bright, curious child who died shortly after I captured his likeness. I discovered, to my initial horror and later fascination, that my camera possesses a unique property. It can capture not just the images of the living, but also the impressions of spirits lingering between worlds. Michael's spirit attached itself to my camera, and through some mechanism I cannot fully explain, he appears in my photographs, especially those containing children. I have found that he forms attachments to certain subjects and may attempt to draw them to him. The enclosed print is of your family as they truly appeared that day, without Michael's presence. I created it from the original plate before destroying it. I suggest you keep this image close, as it may offer some protection to your remaining children. I will not ask for your forgiveness, as what has transpired is beyond forgiveness. Know only that I am ensuring my camera will never again be used to bridge the gap between the world of the living and whatever lies beyond. With deepest regrets, Thomas Holloway." With shaking hands, Evelyn examined the enclosed photograph. It showed her and her 5 children, William still among them, arranged as they had been that day in Holloway's studio. There was no sign of Michael. The image had a remarkable clarity and warmth, capturing her children as they truly were. William with his serious expression but kind eyes, the twins with their mischievous smiles, Robert with his perpetual cowlick, and Catherine clutching her beloved rag doll. This was the portrait she had wanted, a true record of her family before tragedy struck. Evelyn immediately placed the new photograph on the mantelpiece, hoping it would indeed offer some protection. But fear had taken root in her heart, and that night, she gathered her 4 remaining children and fled Blackwood Falls, leaving behind most of their possessions, including the mysterious photograph. They traveled to her mother's home in Connecticut, where they tried to rebuild their shattered lives. The children slowly stopped mentioning their brother's death, and none of them ever spoke of Michael or the portrait again. But Evelyn never forgot, and for years afterward, she refused to allow any photographs to be taken of her family. The house in Blackwood Falls remained empty for almost a year before being purchased by a young couple from Boston, looking for a quiet place to raise their infant son. They found the photograph of the Foster family, the genuine one sent by Holloway, still on the mantelpiece, and, thinking it an attractive antique, kept it as a decoration. For a time, all was well. But when their son reached his 3rd birthday, he began to speak of a friend named Michael who visited him at night, a boy with strange hands who wanted to show him a special place by the pond. As for Thomas Holloway, he was never seen or heard from again. Some years later, a camera matching the description of his prized portrait camera was discovered at the bottom of the Atlantic, dredged up in a fisherman's net off the coast of Maine. The wooden casing was rotted away, the brass fittings green with verdigris, but the glass lens remained intact, and those who looked through it claimed to see, not the world before them, but the solemn face of a dark-haired boy, his pale hand raised in silent greeting. In the decades that followed, rumors circulated about certain photographs taken in the New England area, family portraits where, upon close inspection, an extra child could sometimes be discerned in the background, a solemn boy with dark hair and unusual hands. Those families, it was said, often suffered unexpected tragedies, particularly the loss of children to drowning or inexplicable illnesses. The legend of the Holloway photographs became a whispered tale in photography circles, and collectors learned to be wary of early 20th century portraits from Massachusetts with a particular luminous quality and 6 children when there should be 5. In 1972, a photograph matching this description surfaced at an estate sale in Vermont. The elderly seller claimed it had belonged to her grandmother, who had always insisted that one of the children in the image wasn't really there when the picture was taken. The photograph was purchased by a collector of paranormal artifacts and eventually donated to a small museum of the unexplained in Salem. It remained there, largely unremarked upon, until 2018, when a graduate student researching early photographic techniques scanned the image at high resolution as part of her thesis project. Upon enlarging the digital scan, she noticed something peculiar about the hand of one of the children, a boy standing slightly apart from the family group. The fingers were unnaturally elongated and appeared to be partially webbed, the thumb bent at an anatomically impossible angle, and most disturbing of all, the skin seemed to have a strange, rippled texture, reminiscent of something long submerged in water. Further examination revealed other anomalies. The boy's clothing, while apparently dry in the photograph, showed patterns of discoloration consistent with water damage. His eyes had a peculiar flatness, lacking the tiny reflections that would normally be captured by the camera, and there was a subtle distortion in the air around him, as if the photographic emulsion had reacted differently to his presence than to the other subjects. The student published her findings in an obscure academic journal, noting the technical anomalies in the photograph without speculating on their cause. 3 months after the publication, she drowned during a solo swimming trip at a lake near her university. The official verdict was accidental death due to cramping, but her friends noted that she had been an excellent swimmer and had complained of feeling as if something were pulling at her legs while in the water in the weeks before her death. The digital scan she created still exists in the university's archives. Those who view it often report an unsettling sensation, as if being watched. Some claim that when they look at their own photographs afterward, they occasionally glimpse a shadow in the background, a small, dark shape with long, strange fingers, reaching out as if in invitation. And in certain families who have been exposed to the image, children sometimes speak of dreams where they meet a boy named Michael, who shows them a peaceful pond and tells them not to be afraid of the water. They say if you look closely enough at a group photograph and find an extra face that shouldn't be there, pay special attention to the hands, for it's in these extremities, these appendages meant to connect us to the world, that the truth of Michael's nature reveals itself, neither fully human nor fully spirit, but something caught in between, like an image fixed on a photographic plate, permanent yet not quite real. A boy who drowned but never left, reaching out with his strange webbed fingers to grasp the living and pull them down into the dark, still waters where he waits, eternally 7 years old, eternally lonely, eternally seeking companions to join him in that quiet place beneath the surface of the mill pond in Blackwood Falls. So examine your old family photographs carefully, count the faces, and if you find one more than there should be, a solemn boy with dark hair standing slightly apart, whatever you do, don't look too closely at his hands. For those who see the truth of Michael's hands are already marked, already being drawn toward water, already hearing the soft, insistent whisper of a child who drowned but never truly died. A child who lives now only in photographs, in the silver halides and chemical baths of an art that captures not just light and shadow, but sometimes, just sometimes, things that exist in the liminal spaces between the world of the living and whatever lies beyond. The tale of Thomas Holloway's camera and the boy named Michael serves as a chilling reminder that photographs are more than mere images. They are moments captured, preserved, made permanent, and perhaps, in some cases, they capture more than what the eye can see, more than what should be possible. So the next time you look through old photographs and notice something that doesn't quite belong, a face you don't recognize, a figure standing where no one stood, or hands that don't appear quite human, perhaps it would be wise to set the image aside, or better yet, consign it to flames. For some things, once seen, cannot be unseen. And some beings, once they've noticed you noticing them, will never stop watching you in return. Thomas Holloway understood this too late, and the Foster family paid the price for his fascination with the boundaries between worlds. The camera that captured Michael's essence lies now at the bottom of the ocean, but the images it created still exist, scattered across collections and archives, waiting to be discovered by unsuspecting eyes. And in each of these photographs, if you look carefully enough, you'll find him, the boy who drowned, with his webbed fingers and impossible thumb, reaching out from the past, from beyond death itself, seeking connection, seeking companionship, seeking to pull others down into the dark waters where he dwells. This is the story of the 6 children in the 1911 photograph, 5 living, breathing children and 1 who only appeared when the plate was developed, his presence marked by those strange, inhuman hands that become apparent only when the image is enlarged. It is a story about the power of images to capture more than mere appearance, about the thin veil between life and death, and about the dangers of looking too closely at what might be glimpsed through the cracks in that veil. So when you next stand before a camera, as the shutter prepares to open and capture your image for posterity, perhaps spare a thought for what else might be captured alongside you. What unseen presences might be standing just beyond your perception, waiting for their chance to step into the frame and become, in some small way, part of the living world once more. And if, in a photograph where you know there should be only 5 children, you count 6, look away. Look away, and never seek to enlarge the image of that 6th child's hand. For those who see Michael's true nature are already caught in his gentle, insistent pull toward the waters where he waits, patient and eternal, for new friends to join him in his silent underwater world. The Fosters learned this truth too late. The graduate student who examined the digital scan learned it too late. Countless others throughout the decades since 1911 have learned it too late. Now you know. And knowledge, like a photograph once developed, cannot be undeveloped. It can only be acknowledged or deliberately destroyed before it has the chance to spread its influence further. So, if you've been examining old photographs recently and have noticed something unusual, an extra face, a strange shadow, hands that don't quite look human, perhaps it would be wise to stop, to put the pictures away, to resist the urge to look more closely, to enlarge, to examine. For Michael is still out there, preserved in silver and light, waiting for someone to notice him, to wonder about him, to become fascinated by the strange proportions of his hand. And once he knows you've seen him, it's already too late. The water is calling. Can you hear it? The gentle lapping of waves against the shore of a mill pond. The soft whisper of a child's voice beneath the surface, asking if you'll come and play. Michael is waiting, and his hands, those strange webbed hands with 2 long fingers and impossible joints, are reaching out for yours. Will you take hold, or will you look away before it's too late? The choice, for now, is still yours to make. But remember the 6 children in the 1911 photograph, and know that sometimes, when we peer too deeply into the past begins to peer back at us. And some things, once they've fixed their gaze upon you, never look away again.